Forget everything you think you know about stupid. Today, we're not just looking at fails. We're witnessing masterpieces of self-destruction. This is for the visionaries who looked at a clogged toilet and saw a job for dynamite, for the geniuses who tried to rewire a house using a YouTube tutorial and a fork. These 10 stories are a brutal reminder that the most dangerous thing on any construction site is confidence. 1. Allow us to journey to a quiet suburban basement in Grand Rapids, Michigan on October 14th. Here, a man we'll call Gary was embarking on a noble quest, a revolutionary act of self-reliance. He was about to declare his complete and total independence from the tyranny of the power grid, and, as it turned out, from the structural integrity of his own house. Gary wasn't just a DIY enthusiast. He was the proud valedictorian of YouTube University, holding a freshly minted PhD in overestimating my own intelligence. He'd binged precisely 3.5 videos on free energy, which, in the beautifully simple echo chamber of his mind, made him more qualified than any physicist with a fancy degree and a lifetime of research. He viewed the entire scientific establishment as a grand conspiracy cooked up by Big Energy to sell him their overpriced government-controlled electrons. His life's philosophy was simple. If a professional tells you it's complicated and dangerous, they're just trying to protect their union dues. Gary's grand design for energy independence was a massive, homemade saltwater battery. His plan involved filling a series of enormous 55-gallon plastic vats, the kind you usually see holding pickles at a deli, with a highly conductive saltwater solution, and then running a current through them using graphite plates he'd bought off eBay. He saw himself as a modern-day Nikola Tesla, a lone genius battling the forces of ignorance from his damp, poorly lit basement. Now, for a quick trip back to the high school chemistry class that our hero clearly spent drawing muscle cars in his notebook. When you pass an electric current through salt water, a magical little process called electrolysis occurs. It cracks the water molecule, H2O, into its component parts, a little bit of oxygen and a whole lot of hydrogen. And hydrogen, as you may recall from such famous historical footnotes as the Hindenburg disaster, is the universe's most enthusiastic party animal. It's not just flammable, it's explosively so. It has all the stable, predictable energy of a squirrel on a cocaine binge. So, as Gary proudly connected the final wires, his system roared to life. He saw bubbles rising from the murky depths of his vats and grinned with the satisfaction of a true pioneer. "It's working," he probably yelled to his wife, Brenda, who had poked her head downstairs to ask why the basement smelled like a science fair project gone wrong. "That's the smell of freedom, honey," he'd declared. "Freedom from the man." Those bubbles, of course, were pure, unadulterated bomb fuel, and they were silently, invisibly filling his poorly ventilated basement. The heavy, odorless gas crept along the floor, pooling in the corners, a patient, invisible monster waiting for its cue. And then, the thermostat on the wall clicked. The old, reliable furnace, doing its mundane, everyday job of keeping the house from getting chilly, ignited its pilot light. In that instant, a single tiny flame was introduced to a room that had been turned into a giant, uncontained fuel air bomb. The resulting detonation wasn't just an explosion, it was a spontaneous, unscheduled home renovation project that took the house from a charming 2-story colonial to a modern, open-concept crater. Fire investigators arriving on the scene found the source of the blast almost immediately, mostly because the basement was now geographically distributed across the front yard and several neighboring properties. Gary did, in a way, achieve his ultimate goal. He was finally and permanently off the grid. 2. Picture a quaint 2-story house in a sleepy corner of rural Pennsylvania. It's a symbol of domestic tranquility, the kind of place where the biggest weekend project is supposed to be arguing about what color to paint the guest room. But on this crisp Saturday morning in late September, a war was being waged. A one-man war against a perfectly functional, structurally sound brick chimney. Our general in this conflict was a man named Frank, a homeowner whose frugality was matched only by his truly breathtaking level of self-assurance. Frank believed that hiring professionals was a sign of personal weakness, a tacit admission that you couldn't conquer the physical world with a hammer and sheer, mule-headed stubbornness. He'd probably gotten a quote for a professional demolition, saw the number, laughed out loud, and immediately declared to his wife, "For that much money, I could buy my own sledgehammer and still have enough left over for a steak dinner. And so, his plan was hatched. A plan so brilliantly flawed it deserves its own chapter in the annals of bad ideas. He was going to demolish the chimney himself. Now, a quick primer on the basic, toddler-level physics of making tall things fall over. Structures, especially heavy ones, tend to fall in the direction they are pulled from. To make a tree fall north, you don't stand north of it and give it a hopeful shove. You stand south of it and pull. This is a fundamental law of the universe that has been proven correct by everything from falling redwoods to collapsing Jenga towers. Frank, however, was about to challenge this law to a fight it could not possibly lose. His genius method was to weaken the chimney's base with a sledgehammer, and then guide its descent away from the house by pulling on it with heavy ropes. From inside his own living room. You heard me. He fed the ropes through a second-story window, convinced that his superior understanding of angles would allow him to defy gravity. His neighbor, probably watching in slack-jawed horror from behind his curtains, likely saw the flaw in this plan immediately. But Frank, a man fueled by the unshakable confidence of the profoundly misinformed, was undeterred. He and his equally brilliant brother-in-law, roped in for the occasion, took their positions. "Ready?" Frank probably grunted, spitting on his hands. "Let's show these so-called experts how it's done." They began to pull. The ropes went taut. The old brickwork groaned, a final, weary protest against the sheer stupidity it was being subjected to. But the chimney didn't lean away from the house. It began to pivot, using the last remaining bricks of its weakened base as a fulcrum. A shadow fell over the living room window, a dark brick-shaped eclipse that was growing larger at an alarming rate. It was in that moment, as tons of masonry began its slow, inexorable journey inward, that Frank likely realized he had made a critical error in his calculations. The final act was swift and brutally conclusive. The entire structure collapsed directly into the house, bringing a mountain of brick and mortar down on the very room where our two geniuses were standing. When the dust settled, the emergency services didn't have to ask where the accident was. The house had a brand new multi-ton centerpiece located right where the sofa used to be. Frank had successfully demolished his chimney. He had also, in the process, demolished his living room, his Saturday afternoon, and his continued participation in the gene pool. 3. Behold, the industrial-grade pressure washer. Not the friendly electric model you use to clean your patio furniture, but the gas-powered 4,000 psi behemoth that road crews use to strip graffiti off concrete overpasses. In the right hands, it's a miracle of hydraulic engineering. In the hands of our next protagonist, a man we'll call Dave from suburban Florida, it was a high-pressure, water-powered ticket to the afterlife. It was a sweltering July afternoon, the kind of day where the air feels like a hot, wet towel you can't take off your face. Dave had a simple mission: strip the peeling paint off his two-story house. But Dave's core philosophy was, more power is always the answer. He viewed instruction manuals the way a vampire views a crucifix, with fear and contempt. So he rented the biggest, loudest, most intimidating machine the tool rental place had, and to maximize its efficiency, he fitted it with a 0-degree turbo nozzle. Let's take a moment to appreciate the physics he was about to ignore. Your garden hose operates at about 50 psi. The turbo nozzle on Dave's machine focused 4,000 pounds per square inch of pressure into a single, needle-thin beam of water so powerful it could carve initials into brick. It was, for all intents and purposes, a water-based lightsaber. Armed with this weapon of mass deconstruction, Dave ascended a rickety aluminum extension ladder, which was already a questionable choice on the now wet and slippery vinyl siding. His wife, no doubt, had issued the standard warnings. "Be careful up there, honey," she probably yelled. "Nonsense," he'd have shouted back over the roar of the engine. "I've got this. It'll be done in half the time." He was an artist, and his canvas was his own house. His brush? A weaponized water jet he wielded with the grace of a drunken bear. He swept the wand back and forth, blasting away years of paint in satisfying sheets. Water and paint chips rained down, making the ladder rungs slicker than a politician's promise. And then it happened. A single misplaced foot on a wet rung. The ladder, which was already protesting under the violent kickback of the washer, slid sideways. The fall wasn't instantaneous. It was a multi-stage catastrophe. As he went down, his hand reflexively clenched the trigger, locking it in the on position. The pressure washer, now an untethered, flailing serpent of pure destructive force, began its own freelance work. The water jet, whipping around wildly, first found the aluminum supports of the ladder, slicing through them as if they were made of soft cheese. The ladder disintegrated beneath him. Then, as Dave tumbled through the newly created void, the still screaming jet found a new, softer target. The concentrated beam of water struck his leg, and with the cutting force of a surgical laser, it severed not only his flesh, but his femoral artery. He hit the ground in a horrifying combination of blunt force trauma from the fall and catastrophic high-pressure blood loss. The official report noted a bizarre scene: a perfectly stripped patch of siding, a ladder that looked like it had lost a sword fight with a Jedi, and a homeowner who had tragically learned that some DIY projects require more than just enthusiasm and a truly astonishing disregard for safety. 4. Every man dreams of his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude. For Kevin of Boise, Idaho, this dream took the form of a subterranean man cave, a glorious wine cellar where he could swirl a glass of Merlot and contemplate his own brilliance. But Kevin was a man of action, a visionary who saw professional contractors and structural engineers not as experts, but as well-dressed dream killers. Why pay a fortune for someone to tell you what you can't do when you can grab a shovel and simply do it? And so, on a bright May morning, Kevin descended into his basement with a sparkle in his eye and a plan so profoundly stupid it bordered on performance art. He was going to expand his basement by creating a new room? By digging it out from under his house's existing foundation. Now, let's attend a brief seminar titled, "Why Your House Hasn't Collapsed Yet." A house, you see, is held up by a clever invention called a foundation, which rests on a magical substance called the ground. The entire purpose of this system is to distribute the crushing weight of the structure onto stable, unmoving earth. What Kevin was about to do was akin to performing surgery on a patient by removing all of their bones first to get a better look. He wasn't just digging a hole. He was engaged in a one-man archaeological dig aimed at discovering just how quickly gravity could foreclose on his mortgage. His tools were simple: a $5 bucket, a rusty shovel, and an ego that was not, unfortunately, load-bearing. Day after day, he toiled, hauling bucket after bucket of dirt out from under the corner of his house. His wife, noticing the new ever-growing mountain of earth in the backyard, probably asked the logical question, "Honey, are you sure this is safe?" To which Kevin, wiping a confident bead of sweat from his brow, likely replied, "It's just dirt, babe. They build these things to withstand anything." He failed to grasp that the anything the builders had in mind did not include the owner actively removing the very ground the house was built on. The first signs of trouble were subtle: a new creak in the floorboards upstairs, a door that suddenly wouldn't close properly. Kevin dismissed these as the house simply settling. And he was right. The house was indeed settling, just at a rate usually associated with a controlled demolition. The final act began with an almost musical sound: the high-pitched shriek of nails being pulled from wood under immense, tortured pressure. This was followed by a deep guttural groan, the sound of support beams surrendering their decades-long fight. The house didn't just collapse, it pancaked. With a deafening roar, the entire two-story structure dropped straight down, crushing the basement and its lone occupant into a new, highly compressed geological layer. When the rescue crews arrived, they didn't need a map. They just needed to find the spot where a house used to be. Kevin had finally gotten his wine cellar, a dark, cramped space with zero headroom and a vintage of crushed drywall and broken dreams, where he would be laid to rest for all eternity. 5. Let's travel to a garage in rural Wisconsin, where a man we'll call Dale was about to become a pioneer in the field of catastrophic workshop engineering. Dale was a man of principle, and his primary principle was that paying full price for a properly manufactured tool was for suckers. He saw a $500 price tag on a new table saw not as the cost of safety and precision, but as a personal challenge from the universe. $500 bucks? He'd probably scoffed. I could build a better one for 20. And so he set out to create his masterpiece, a homemade table saw that would stand as a monument to his own frugality. Now, let's quickly discuss why a real table saw weighs as much as a small car. It's typically made of heavy cast iron with a perfectly balanced motor housing. This is all designed for one reason: to contain and control the terrifying rotational energy of a 10-inch blade spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. Dale's design, however, treated these principles as mere suggestions. His materials consisted of a warped piece of 3/4-inch plywood he'd had lying around since the Nixon administration, 2 wobbly sawhorses, and his trusty handheld circular saw. His grand plan was to mount the circular saw, a tool specifically designed to be held firmly with 2 hands, upside down under the plywood, held in place by nothing more than a couple of wood screws and a prayer. He wasn't building a tool. He was building an unguided missile with a power cord. The assembly was a sight to behold. He proudly fastened the saw, its 7-inch harbinger of doom now pointing skyward, to the underside of his new table. He flipped the switch. The machine didn't hum to life with a clean, reassuring whir. It erupted in an angry, unbalanced roar. The entire contraption vibrated like a cheap motel bed, shaking so violently that a jar of screws on a nearby shelf rattled itself to the floor. Undeterred, Dale grabbed a piece of 2x4 for the inaugural test cut. This was the moment of truth. He pushed the wood into the screaming, spinning blade. For a glorious half-second it worked. Sawdust flew, and then the intense vibration reached its crescendo. The wood screws, which were never designed to withstand that kind of sideways, shearing, vibrating force, collectively surrendered. They tore free from the plywood. The saw, now liberated from its flimsy prison, did not simply stop. The torque from the still spinning blade caused it to kick upwards with incredible force, ripping through the plywood table as if it were a sheet of wet cardboard. For a brief, terrifying moment, the saw was airborne and spinning, a veritable angel of death unleashed in a small garage. The police report later was a masterpiece of understatement. The victim's injuries were found to be inconsistent with continued life. Dale had, in the end, proven his point. You absolutely can build your own table saw for less than $20. The final cost, however, turned out to be significantly higher. 6. There are many ways to deal with a stubborn weed. You can pull it. You can spray it with store-bought herbicide. Or, if you're Stan from suburban Florida, you can declare a level of thermonuclear war on it that would make a 5-star general blush. Stan was a man who viewed his perfectly manicured lawn not as a yard, but as a kingdom, and any dandelion that dared sprout within its borders was an act of high treason. A standard propane weed torch, the kind that gently toasts pests into submission, was, for Stan, a pathetic compromise. It lacked finality. And Stan was all about finality. His project for the afternoon was to upgrade his torch into something truly magnificent, a tool of such overwhelming power that weeds would tell cautionary tales about it for generations. His brilliant idea was to feed a line from a pure oxygen tank directly into the propane stream. Let's take a quick science break for anyone who wasn't paying attention in class. A normal propane torch works by mixing propane with the air around it, which is about 21% oxygen. It gets hot. But when you introduce a stream of 100% pure oxygen, you're not just making the flame hotter. You're fundamentally changing the laws of combustion. You are no longer building a better weed torch. You are building a crude, unstable, and spectacularly dangerous cutting torch, the kind welders use to slice through solid steel. And you are attaching it to a portable tank of highly flammable gas. What could possibly go wrong? Stan, ignoring every warning label ever printed, cobbled his creation together with a series of mismatched brass fittings and a generous amount of hope. He wheeled his contraption, which looked less like a garden tool and more like something a villain in a Mad Max movie would wield, onto his driveway. He cracked open the valves. The hiss was sharper, more aggressive. He clicked the igniter. The flame wasn't the gentle orange roar he was used to. It was a blinding white-blue jet, a miniature rocket engine that screamed with ferocious intensity. He aimed it at the offending dandelion. The weed didn't just burn. It was instantly vaporized, erased from existence. But Stan's slapdash engineering had a fatal flaw. The pressure from the oxygen tank was far greater than the pressure from the propane tank. The flame didn't just shoot out, it shot backwards. Up the propane hose in a phenomenon known as backflow. The pure oxygen hit the liquid propane still inside the tank. In less than a microsecond, the tank was no longer a fuel container. It was a bomb, on the verge of a bleave. A boiling liquid expanding vapor explosion. The result was not a pop, but a deafening, earth-shattering boom. The weed was gone. So was the driveway, the front of the garage, Stan's prize-winning rose bushes, and of course, Stan. Firefighters later found pieces of the propane tank embedded in his neighbor's roof. In his quest to achieve total victory over a single dandelion, Stan had successfully re-landscaped his entire property in the most spectacular way imaginable. 7. Let us now visit a small, unassuming bathroom in a Houston suburb, the future site of an event that would forever redefine the term plumbing emergency. Our protagonist, a man named Ricky, was a firm believer in the American principle that if a problem can't be solved with overwhelming, explosive force, then you're simply not using enough of it. He was faced with a challenge as old as indoor plumbing itself: a stubbornly clogged toilet. A lesser man might have reached for a plunger. A slightly more ambitious man might have bought a plumbing snake. But Ricky? Ricky saw this not as a chore, but as an opportunity for innovation. He viewed plungers as a sign of weakness, a pathetic surrender to a clog that was clearly laughing at him. His solution was far more elegant, far more definitive. He was going to use an M80 firecracker. Now, for the uninitiated, an M80 is not your friendly neighborhood firework. It's essentially a quarter stick of dynamite wrapped in a festive red paper tube. It's a tool designed to produce a concussion blast so powerful it can shatter windows and scare livestock in the next county. In Ricky's mind, it was the ultimate drain cleaner. His plan was a masterstroke of simplicity. He would light the fuse, drop the M80 into the toilet bowl, and flush, sending his little red torpedo on a one-way mission to obliterate the blockage. Let's briefly touch upon the science he was so spectacularly ignoring. First, you have the explosive. Second, you have a contained, water-filled porcelain bowl. And third, you have the often overlooked secret ingredient of any sewage system: methane gas. It's a highly flammable byproduct of, well, you know. Ricky was not just trying to clear a pipe. He was about to conduct a high-stakes chemistry experiment in the most confined room of his house. He lit the fuse. The hiss was a tiny prelude to the coming symphony of destruction. He dropped it in, flushed with a triumphant grin, and probably took a half step back, expecting to hear a muffled thump from deep within the bowels of his house. Instead, the M80 detonated the second it hit the water, with its explosive force trapped and magnified by the porcelain chamber. The result was instantaneous and breathtakingly violent. The toilet didn't just crack, it ceased to exist as a single object. It turned into a ceramic grenade, exploding upwards and outwards with the force of a claymore mine. Shards of razor-sharp porcelain, traveling at bullet-like speeds, shredded everything in the room. But the real showstopper was the ignition of the sewer gas. The initial blast created a secondary, far more powerful fuel-air explosion that blew the bathroom door off its hinges and sent a geyser of fire and raw sewage erupting into the hallway. When the paramedics arrived, they were greeted by a scene that looked like a Jackson Pollock painting, created by a very angry, very unsanitary god. The bathroom was gone. The toilet was now just a jagged hole in the floor. And Ricky, who had been standing proudly over his handiwork, had received a very personal, very final lesson in the difference between a plumbing problem and a demolition project. He had at least successfully cleared the clog. 8. In a verdant, rain-soaked corner of the Pacific Northwest, a man named Alan was living the dream. He was a homesteader, a rugged individualist, a man who saw the electrical grid as a form of societal weakness. He was going to generate his own power, harnessing the babbling creek that ran through his backyard. His creation was a monument to ambition over ability. A homemade hydroelectric generator, cobbled together from an old alternator, some bicycle parts, and a water wheel that looked suspiciously like a repurposed picnic table. But the true genius of Alan's work wasn't in the generator itself. It was in the wiring. He ran the power to his workshop using a series of ungrounded, poorly insulated extension cords he'd had lying around, some of which were held together with nothing more than electrical tape and a profound sense of optimism. Let's have a quick life-saving chat about electricity. Electricity is lazy. It is always looking for the shortest, easiest path to the ground. This is why professional electricians use things like grounding wires and insulation and not leaving exposed cables lying in the mud. Alan, however, saw these as expensive, unnecessary frills. His system was a testament to the "if it works school of thought. And for a while during the dry summer months, it did work. He had lights. He could run his power tools. He was a king in his own off-grid castle. But then, the autumn rains came. A massive storm rolled in, the kind that turns creeks into raging rivers and backyards into shallow lakes. The water level rose, engulfing Alan's magnificent generator. The water, an excellent conductor, found the frayed, taped-up connections in his wiring. The system shorted out. But the power didn't just stop. The live wires, now submerged, began to energize the water itself. Alan's entire flooded backyard, the very ground he walked on, was transformed into a deadly, invisible, electrified moat. He was inside his house, blissfully unaware, probably admiring the storm, when he noticed his lights flicker and die. "Damn generator must have gotten swamped," he likely grumbled, pulling on his rubber boots. He believed the boots would protect him, a common and fatally flawed assumption when you're about to wade into a giant high-voltage puddle. He opened his back door to go assess the damage. He took one step off his porch. The moment his boot touched the shimmering surface of the water, 220 volts of raw, untamed, homemade electricity found the path of least resistance it had been searching for. The current shot up his leg, through his torso, and stopped his heart before he even had time to register the shock. He was found the next morning by a neighbor, floating peacefully in his own personal, hydroelectric death trap. He had successfully harnessed the power of the creek, just not in the way he'd ever intended. 9. The damp, musty smell of his basement was an affront to a man named Barry's very soul. Barry, from Dayton, Ohio, was a man of precision and control. A leaky wall wasn't just a structural issue. It was a personal insult from the forces of chaos. He decided he was going to waterproof his basement, and he was going to do it with the kind of overkill that would make the Army Corps of Engineers proud. After extensive research on the internet, he bypassed the standard consumer-grade sealants and ordered a 5-gallon drum of a 2-part industrial epoxy. This wasn't your friendly neighborhood caulk. This was the kind of stuff they used to seal nuclear submarine hulls. The warning label on the drum was a litany of terrifying chemical terms and featured no less than 3 skull and crossbones symbols. It screamed, in all caps, for use in extremely well-ventilated areas only. Inhalation of fumes can be fatal. Barry, however, interpreted this not as a dire warning, but as a challenge to his superior intellect. He believed the key to a perfect permanent seal was to control the environment. To ensure a perfect cure, free from the corrupting influence of outside humidity, he decided to seal himself inside the basement. This wasn't just a bad idea, it was a meticulously planned act of self-entombment. He gathered his supplies, the epoxy, a roller, and several rolls of heavy-duty duct tape. He went downstairs and, with the focus of a surgeon, he sealed every window and every crack around the basement door from the inside. He had created a perfect, airtight chamber. He then cracked open the drum of epoxy. The fumes that billowed out were not just smelly, they were a dense, invisible cloud of volatile organic compounds, a chemical cocktail designed to displace oxygen and shut down the human central nervous system. As Barry began to roll the thick, tar-like substance onto the walls, he was breathing in a concentrated neurotoxin. The first sign would have been a slight dizziness, a lightheaded feeling he probably dismissed as a head rush from his hard work. Then, his motor skills would have started to fail. His movements would have become clumsy, his vision blurry. By the time he realized something was catastrophically wrong, it was already too late. He would have stumbled towards the door he had so carefully sealed, his fumbling hands unable to tear away the layers of duct tape. He passed out, collapsing onto the floor of the very room he was trying to protect. He died peacefully, a victim of his own quest for perfection, suffocated by the fumes of his own brilliant solution. When his wife came home and couldn't get the basement door open, she called the fire department. They had to break it down, only to find Barry, perfectly preserved in his self-made, chemically sealed sarcophagus. The basement walls, it should be noted, were flawlessly waterproofed. 10. In the bone-chilling cold of a Minnesota winter, a man named Carl faced a homeowner's rite of passage, the frozen pipe. But Carl was not a man to be trifled with by mere thermodynamics. He was a problem solver, a hands-on guy who believed the solution to any problem could be found in his garage. His weapon of choice for this particular battle was a high-powered propane torch. His plan was to descend into the dark, cramped crawl space under his house and apply a little, gentle persuasion to the frozen copper pipes. Now, let's talk about what happens when you apply a 3,000-degree flame to a sealed tube full of frozen water. The ice doesn't just melt, it turns directly into steam. And steam takes up about 1/700 times more volume than water. If this expansion has nowhere to go, you are no longer thawing a pipe, you are actively manufacturing a pipe bomb. Carl, blissfully unaware of the physics lesson he was about to receive, wriggled into the tight crawl space. He found the frozen section and fired up his torch. The hissing blue flame licked at the copper. He held it there, patiently, impatiently. He figured more heat meant faster results, so he held the flame in one single spot, focusing the intense energy like a laser. The copper began to glow a dull cherry red. Inside the pipe, a catastrophic pressure event was building. The water in that section flash-boiled, creating a pocket of superheated steam trapped between two solid plugs of ice. The pressure skyrocketed from a normal 60 psi to thousands of pounds per square inch in a matter of seconds. The pipe didn't leak. It failed catastrophically. With a deafening bang that was heard 3 houses away, the section of copper pipe exploded. But it wasn't just an explosion of air. It was an explosion of steam and boiling water, focused by the ruptured pipe into a perfect directional jet. Carl, who was lying directly underneath his project, was hit with a blast of 400-degree steam and scalding water. In the confined, inescapable space, he was flash-cooked instantly. He had successfully thawed the pipe. In fact, he had successfully turned a minor plumbing inconvenience into a high-pressure steam cannon, with himself as the one and only target. When they found him, it was clear he had solved his frozen pipe problem permanently. So, there you have it. 10 glorious examples of why some tools should require an IQ test. Now for the real question. Let's be honest, we all have that one relative or friend. The one you'd never ever trust with a power tool or a can of gasoline. You don't have to name names, but describe the single dumbest DIY idea you've ever heard them seriously propose. The world needs to know about these unmade disasters. And if you want to avoid ending up in a future episode, hit subscribe. Consider it cheap life insurance.